There is a particular quality to the first morning after a loss. You wake, and for 1 or 2 seconds before full consciousness arrives, everything is as it was, and then it arrives, not gradually, all at once, the specific absolute weight of the thing that is no longer there, and the day begins again in a world that is identical to yesterday's in every external detail and completely, irreversibly different in the one that matters most. Grief is the strangest of human experiences because it is both entirely universal and entirely private. Every human being who has ever loved something has lost something, and yet grief, in its specific texture, in the precise shape of its absence, in the particular way it arrives in your body and rewrites your sense of what normal is, that grief belongs only to you. It cannot be fully shared. It cannot be compared. It cannot be resolved by someone who has not lived it, telling you how long it should take, or which stage you are supposed to be in, or when you should begin to feel better. This audiobook will not tell you any of those things. What it will do is sit with you in the reality of grief, honestly, without sentimentality, without the platitudes that mean well and land like stones, and offer what I believe is more useful than any amount of reassurance and understanding of what grief actually is, what it is doing in you, what it has always been doing in us, and what the wisest human traditions have found to be true about living with it in a way that eventually, in its own time, allows life to continue. Not life as it was, that is gone, life as it will be, shaped by the loss carrying it, changed by it in ways that are not only diminishment, a life that includes rather than escapes. Part 1. What grief actually is. We need to begin by dismantling something, a framework so embedded in our culture's understanding of grief that most people have absorbed it without ever consciously choosing to. The 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, developed by the psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her 1969 work with terminally ill patients, were never intended as a universal map. They were observations drawn from a specific population facing a specific kind of loss. Kubler-Ross herself, later in her life, expressed concern about how rigidly the model had been applied, and yet it became, for decades, the dominant cultural script for how grief is supposed to proceed, implying to everyone who grieves differently that they are doing it wrong. The research that has accumulated since tells a far messier and far more honest story. Grief does not move in stages. It does not progress from denial toward acceptance along a predictable path. It moves in waves, in spirals, in sudden returnings to places you thought you had already passed through. It visits on a Tuesday afternoon, unprovoked, long after the formal period of mourning has ended and the world has moved on and stopped asking how you are. It arrives in the smell of something, in a song heard unexpectedly, in a moment of happiness that is interrupted without warning by the sharp knowledge that the person you most want to tell about the happiness is the one who is gone. The psychologist George Bonanno, whose decades of research on resilience and bereavement have challenged many of the field's most comfortable assumptions, found that the most common trajectory following loss is not the prolonged depression that the stage model implies is normal. Most people, he found, demonstrate remarkable resilience, not the absence of grief, but the capacity to continue functioning, to experience positive emotion even in the midst of loss, to maintain what he calls a stable trajectory through circumstances that feel anything but stable. This does not mean the grief is not real. It means that human beings are more capable of carrying grief alongside living than any stage model suggests. Grief is not the opposite of functioning. Grief is not the opposite of joy. Grief is not even, in many cases, the opposite of peace. It is something that exists alongside all of these things, woven into the texture of daily life, not as an interruption to be resolved, but as a presence to be acknowledged, a weight to be carried, a relationship with what is lost that does not end simply because the lost thing is gone. The word grief comes from the Latin gravere, to burden, to make heavy. This etymology is honest in a way that most modern discussions of grief are not. Grief is heavy. It does not become light through the right attitude or the right timeline or the right therapeutic framework. What changes, for most people who move through it well, is not the weight but the capacity to carry it, the development of a strength not chosen, not wanted, built reluctantly and at great cost that was not there before the loss, and that the loss, in a strange and terrible way, made possible. Grief is, at its most essential, the price of attachment. It is what love looks like when the object of love is no longer present, which means that to grieve fully, to allow the weight of a loss its full reality rather than managing it, minimizing it, distracting from it with relentless forward motion, is not weakness. It is the honest acknowledgement of how much something mattered. It is love continuing. Part 2. The loss is nobody gives you permission to mourn. There is a hierarchy of grief in our culture. At the top sit the losses that are publicly recognized. Death, particularly the death of someone close, carries with it rituals, ceremonies, condolence cards, time off work, the social permission to be visibly undone. These losses are real and they are devastating, and the recognition they receive is appropriate. But beneath them, occupying a vast and largely unacknowledged territory, sit all the other losses, the ones for which there is no ritual, no ceremony, no socially sanctioned period of mourning, the ones people grieve alone in private, often without even the language to name what they are experiencing as grief. The psychologist Kenneth Doka coined the term disenfranchised grief to describe the mourning of losses that are not publicly recognized or socially supported, the grief of a miscarriage, particularly an early one when the world has barely registered the pregnancy, the grief of a relationship that ended before it was formal enough to warrant sympathy, that particular loneliness of mourning someone you were never officially with, the grief of a friendship that dissolved without a definitive ending, the grief of a career that did not become what you believed it would, the grief of a version of yourself, younger, more open, less burdened, that you can no longer return to. These losses are not smaller than the recognized ones. In some cases, they are more complicated, harder to process precisely because there is no framework for them, no permission to stop and feel them fully. No one bringing food to the door or sitting with you in the weight of it. They are grieved in the margins of ordinary life, alongside the continuing demands of a world that does not know to slow down. And perhaps the most universally unacknowledged grief is the grief of the unlived life. The accumulated mourning for all the paths not taken, all the versions of yourself that were possible and are no longer. Every choice forecloses other choices. Every yes to this life is a quiet no to other lives, and the human being who has lived long enough carries within them kind of grief for the roads that branched away, for the selves that were possible and are now simply not. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote about what he called the task of our existence, not to resolve the tensions of life, but to hold them, to live them, to allow the contradictions their full reality without reaching for a premature resolution. Disenfranchised grief asks for exactly this. Not the ceremony of recognized loss, but something quieter and perhaps more demanding, the willingness to name what you are carrying, to yourself if to no one else, and to give it the respect of your full, unhurried attention. What this means practically is permission, the permission to grieve what the world has not given you permission to grieve, to say inside where it matters that this loss was real, that it mattered, that the fact that no one sent flowers does not mean the absence is not felt, that you are allowed to miss what you were not allowed to mourn publicly, that grief, wherever it arises, deserves exactly the same honest, compassionate attention regardless of whether the world has a category for it. Part 3. What the WISEST traditions know about impermanence. Every major philosophical and contemplative tradition that has grappled seriously with the human condition has arrived, sooner or later, at the same inescapable truth: everything ends. Everything that exists in time is subject to change and loss. The question that divides these traditions is not whether this is true, it is, but what the wisest response to it is: how to live in full awareness of impermanence without being paralyzed by it, how to love fully, knowing that love always carries within it the seed of grief. The Stoics practiced what they called negative visualization, the deliberate, regular contemplation of loss before it occurs, not as pessimism, not as a way of dampening joy, but as a way of bringing full presence to what is still here. Marcus Aurelius, who lost children, friends, and colleagues throughout his reign, wrote about holding everything he loved as something borrowed rather than owned. Amor fati, love of fate, including the fate of loss, was not a resignation but a discipline, the practice of meeting what comes, including what is taken, with a quality of open-handed acceptance that does not deny the pain, but does not make the pain worse by demanding that reality be other than it is. The Buddhist tradition goes deeper still into the nature of impermanence, the teaching of anicca, that all conditioned things are transient, is not offered as a reason for detachment from life but as a ground for a particular kind of freedom within it. When we cling to what is impermanent, when we demand that people, circumstances, and our own sense of self remain fixed in defiance of their nature, we create a suffering that is additional to the loss itself. The loss is inevitable. The suffering of resistance to the loss is, in principle, optional, not easily optional, not without practice and grace, and the kind of hard-won wisdom that is only available on the other side of genuine grief, but optional in the deepest sense, not required by the loss itself, only by our relationship to it. The existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about what he called being toward death, the recognition of our finitude not as a depressing fact to be managed, but as the very thing that makes life meaningful. It is the boundedness of things, the fact that this afternoon, this conversation, this person sitting across from you will not last forever, that gives them their weight and their color and the quality of mattering. Without loss, there is no love. Without impermanence, there is no meaning. The grief is not the opposite of the gift, it is the proof of it. None of this makes grief easier in the immediate hours of it. Philosophy does not anesthetize. The Stoic emperor still wept. The Buddhist teacher still felt the weight of absence. The existentialist philosopher was not immune to the specific ache of a specific person gone. What these traditions offer is not the removal of grief, but a context for it, a way of understanding loss that does not add the suffering of confusion and resistance to the suffering that is simply, unavoidably, the cost of having loved. Part 4. The difference between grief that moves and grief that stays. There is something that grief researchers call complicated grief, now often referred to as prolonged grief disorder, that is distinct from the ordinary, if devastating, trajectory of acute loss. It is characterized not by the intensity of grief but by its stasis, the grief that does not move, that does not soften at the edges with time, that keeps the bereaved person as close to the moment of loss months or years later as they were in the first days of it. What distinguishes this from ordinary grief is not weakness or insufficient resilience. Research suggests it is more often a specific relationship to the lost person or thing, one in which the loss has become tangled with the griever's sense of identity, with unfinished relational business, with guilt or anger or love so large that moving through it feels like betrayal, as if grief is the last form of loyalty available, as if to soften in the grief is to abandon the person who is gone. This is one of the most important things to understand about the difference between grief that moves and grief that becomes a residence. Grief does not honor the dead by remaining acute. The person who is gone is not more remembered because you are more devastated. What they left in you, the ways they shaped you, the things they taught you, the version of yourself that exists because they were in your life, that is not diminished by the softening of acute pain. It is, if anything, more available when the immediate weight of loss has settled enough to let you look at it clearly. The psychologist William Worden developed a task-based model of grief that has proven more accurate to lived experience than any stage model. He described 4 tasks, not stages, that grief asks of us: to accept the reality of the loss, to work through the pain of grief, to adjust to a world in which what is lost is absent. And this is the task that matters most here: to find an enduring connection with what is lost while embarking on a new life, not to let go, to carry differently. This final task overturns one of the most damaging ideas in popular grief discourse, the idea that the goal of grieving is to achieve closure. Closure implies a door that closes, a chapter that ends, a compartmentalization of the lost person or thing into a sealed part of the past. But human beings do not work this way. Love does not work this way. What the research shows consistently is that people who grieve well do not close the door on what they have lost. They find a way to carry it, transformed, internalized, integrated into the ongoing self as they continue into the life ahead of them. The psychiatrist Robert Niemeyer describes this as the reconstruction of meaning, the active, sometimes painful, ultimately creative process of rebuilding a sense of the world and the self that can accommodate the loss, not a world in which the loss did not happen, not a self that is unchanged by it, a world and a self that are large enough to hold both the loss and the continuing life, both the absence and the presence, both the grief and, in its own time, at its own pace, the return of something that resembles, however quietly, however differently, the capacity for joy. Part 5. How to carry what you cannot put down. I want to speak now not in the language of research, but in the language of what grief actually asks of a person in the dailiness of living with it, not the acute phase, the long middle, the months and years after the world has moved on, after the casseroles have stopped arriving and the check-ins have become less frequent and you are expected, by everyone including sometimes yourself, to be further along than you are. The first thing grief asks is simply this: to be felt, not managed, not optimized, not reframed into growth before its time. Felt, the temptation to move quickly past the pain of loss into busyness, into helping others, into the 1,000 productive activities that keep the grief at a manageable distance, is understandable and very human, and taken too far counterproductive, because grief that is not felt does not dissolve, it deposits, it accumulates in the body, in the mood, in the low-grade exhaustion of carrying something you have never put down properly, because you have never allowed yourself to feel its full weight. Feeling it does not mean being consumed by it. It means creating with intention the conditions in which grief can be present, a particular time, a particular place, a particular practice. Whether that is sitting quietly, or writing, or walking, or speaking to someone who knew what you have lost, in which you lower the defenses enough to let the weight be fully felt, and then when the time is complete, return to the rest of the day, This is not indulgence. It is the most efficient processing available. The grief that is met directly moves more reliably than the grief that is avoided. The writer C.S. Lewis, in his raw and remarkable account of the grief that followed his wife's death, wrote about how grief felt like fear, the same physical symptoms, the hollow chest, the restlessness, the difficulty concentrating. What he discovered as the months went on was not that the grief left, but that he changed in his relationship to it, that it became less like something happening to him and more like something he was carrying, still heavy, still real, but his part of him, not separate from him, not against him. The second thing grief asks is continuity of connection, the idea that healthy grieving requires severing the bond with what is lost, moving on, letting go, achieving closure has been substantially overturned by what researchers call continuing bonds theory, the finding that people who grieve well do not relinquish their relationship with what they have lost. They transform it. They find new forms for the continuing connection through memory, through ritual, through the internal conversation with the lost person that continues long after the person is gone, through the carrying forward of what they valued and what they taught into the life that continues. The person who is gone does not need to be forgotten for you to continue. They can be carried. You can speak to them still. You can ask yourself what they would have thought about the decision you are facing. You can honor what they loved by loving it in their absence. The relationship changes form. It does not end. And the third thing grief asks, the longest, slowest, most demanding thing, is patience with yourself. The grief will not follow your timeline. It will arrive when you are not prepared for it, and absent when you have made space for it. It will feel on some days as raw as it did in the beginning. It will feel on other days like something you might eventually survive. Both of those are true. Neither is the final verdict. You are not doing it wrong when it is hard. You are not betraying what you lost when it is, briefly, less hard. You are simply human, doing the most human of all things, learning to carry the weight of love through a world that keeps moving, even when you are not ready for it to. The closing. I want to end with something I believe in, that grief, when you sit with it long enough, eventually teaches, not as comfort, though I hope it offers some, as something truer than comfort, as what the weight is actually made of, when you finally allow yourself to feel it completely. The grief is the love. That is all it is, not the opposite of love, not what replaces love when the loved thing is gone. Love itself, continuing with nowhere now to land, turned inward, turned backward, moving in the only direction still available to it. And when you understand this, really understand it, not as a phrase but as a felt reality, the grief does not become smaller, but it becomes somehow more bearable, because it is no longer only pain, it is also evidence. Evidence of how much something mattered, evidence that you were capable of loving in a way that left a real mark, evidence that your life has been touched by something worth grieving. Not everyone gets to grieve like this. Not everyone has loved something that made this particular weight possible. The grief, as strange as this sounds, is a privilege, the price of a life that held something real. The poet Mary Oliver, near the end of her life, wrote, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" What grief teaches, if we let it, is the full weight of that question, not as pressure, as clarification, as the sudden, sharp, loss-sharpened knowledge of what matters and what does not, of who you want to be in the time that remains, of what you would grieve if it were gone, and whether you are honoring it while it is still here. You are carrying something. You have been carrying it perhaps for longer than you have fully acknowledged. It will not be put down, not entirely, not for the things that mattered most, but it can be carried differently, more consciously, more honestly, with the recognition that the Weight is not evidence of damage, but of depth, not of something broken in you, but of something whole enough to have loved that completely. Whatever you were not ready to lose, you are allowed to miss it still. You are allowed to carry it forward. You are allowed to let it change you in the ways that loss always changes the people honest enough to feel it fully. And you are allowed, in its own time and at its own pace, and by its own mysterious process, to find that the world is still here, that life is still here, that you changed heavier, and in some ways more fully yourself than you were before, are still here too. That is not forgetting, that is carrying, and carrying done with honesty and love is one of the most human things there is.